She has a PhD. And most importantly for me, she is the host of my all-time favorite podcast. Well, two of my favorite podcasts. But
yeah, seriously.
Raising Good Humans that she started in 2019. And I think I was one of the first listeners, if I can be so bold as to say.
I feel like you were pretty much
I DM'd her right away. I'm like, all I want to do is take walks and listen to you talk. So we're also so excited to have Elise Loehnen here, who has Pulling the Thread, which is the other podcast that accompanies me on all my walks, where she just deep dives into all topics related to women and life and spirituality and health and mental health and everything we all care about, I think. But they're both New York Times best-selling authors.
High five.
And it's really amazing. I think they're both the bomb. And I'm so happy we get to spend an hour here together with them, listening to them talk. And they're both going to be here signing their books after. So Elise's book, if you haven't read it, must read.
It's so magnificent.
Apparently, these two brainstormed on the title for Aliza's book. So we're going to hear about all the behind-the-scenes secrets that we don't know and more today. And thank you to Tumbleweed for sponsoring this event. Andy Kimmelman, who's the founder of Tumbleweed. We have him to thank for the books, keeping us all smart and curious.
Thank you.
Community building. So let's go.
Are you a dad too? Are you a dad?
I'm a dad too.
Oh, good. We need some more dads in the room,
and
more
the only
dads.
dad in the room.
Maybe one
Two
more
dads.
dad. 2 dads. I know.
It's
a thing.
It's a thing.
Yeah. We were communing about. Have you been interviewed yet? I had my first male interview me.
I just said Zibby was here, and now Zibby's here.
Hi,
Zibby. Zibby's Bookshop. Zoom in the bathroom.
That's amazing.
I zoom in the bathroom.
Go ahead.
I love it.
It's very informal here.
Have you been interviewed yet by a man?
Well, I feel bad because I said I hadn't been, but I forgot that Mo News had interviewed me, which I think was not what we were really talking about, but he is a man.
Yeah.
So that wasn't quite the point, was that particular kind of podcast, but I do have one scheduled with a man who is sort of well-known in the podcast world in the summer, but he's not a dad.
Oh, interesting.
So we still haven't infiltrated dads.
The bigger context is that I had written about male podcasters and how they don't interview women. They don't interview female experts, despite the preponderance of female experts and doctors and scientists. And I just had my first interview with a man this week about my book. So I've done
that's amazing.
Probably 100 podcast interviews, and I could not get a man to interview me. And then you hadn't either. Yeah. It's a thing. You'll start noticing it.
Now there's one though.
Now there's one. But it like leaves all of these conversations in the space of women's nurturance and care. And it's not fair.
I think in the case of mine, it's not as serious seeming for some reason.
What do you mean?
Like, you look at the book, you look at the hand, you think about parenting, and you just somehow it doesn't feel urgent because this I cannot explain. I mean, I can.
Oh,
because I think it's a hard conversation to have.
Yeah.
But I do, because I work with dads, and I think dads very much care about this, but it's maybe the general topic of parenting feels that it skews very much.
I know it does. And it's one of those things I think we don't actually pay enough attention to. And particularly at this moment in time where I'm sure your phone's ringing off the hook. Mm-hmm. And how do you, when you think about this moment compared to when you started, which hasn't been that long. I mean, I interview a lot of, octogenarians who have been doing this for a really long time. But what do you...
That made me feel so young.
You're just a spring chicken in this space. But so when you think about the span of your career, do you feel optimistic about kids, or are you more and more scared?
I actually think we are always terrified, every generation, and then we forget and talk about how much better we had it.
Yeah.
I think there are some things right now that are really testing our capacity to bounce back. But the reason I'm not scared is because I really do believe that there are certain fundamental things that we have control over that buffer the impact of all of the terrible things that come our way. And we just need to know those things, feel emboldened, and then I'm not scared.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons, and I'm sure that you guys are all already fans, I am, but one of the reasons that I love you, besides your humor and intelligence and just the good times that we have that aren't about parenting, but that you, in some ways, cut the BS or this like preponderance of information that's coming at parents, where there's the suggestion in some ways that we all need a PhD and that every decision is so impactful in your child's life, and it's all on you, and that your kid is certainly doomed if you don't have the right script or the right response for every scenario. And I find you very reassuring. I mean,
that
principles.
Makes me so happy.
No, but it's true. I think you're I mean, can you guys all agree that she's like a balm?
Chill.
Yeah, in a place where it's like, wait, is parenting? I know that our world is more complicated.
Our world is absolutely more complicated.
Yeah,
I'll give you that.
It is. But when you look at the research, when you look at the data, what's the appropriate response in parents? Is it just not still the same principles? I think I know the answer, but
I mean, the same principles. I think what's really cool is research always takes a long time to get from page to stage. That was so theater geeky, but it's in my book. But from from academia to being out in the world, it takes sometimes well over a decade. Sometimes I think the average is something like 17 years, right?
Yeah.
So I don't feel like anything is that I don't think we're missing information where it's like, oh my God, we're about to find out that you're supposed to blah. Yeah. And I think there's lots of conversations out there about, have we swung too far to, caring about our children's feelings and being obsessed with our kids' feelings and how to get this right and all of that. And maybe culturally we have, but research-wise, it's been saying the same thing and will continue to say the same thing. And I see absolutely no indication that we're going to change what has been true in the developmental science for decades, which is some version of these 5 principles and, the more simple version of just authoritative parenting.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, I like.
Did that answer that question?
Yeah, I think so. And we'll have an opportunity for everyone to answer questions or ask questions. But thinking about that too, how we gloss over the anxiety or what we grew up in or bathed in. And, I was a Cold War kid. I grew up in Montana, and there's still these silos all over Montana with warheads in them.
Oh my gosh.
It's so isn't that odd?
Yeah.
There are tons in Montana. And I remember, that was my parents were obsessed with the Cold War and protesting, bake sales instead of bombs.
Yeah.
And in my baby book, my mom really didn't fill it out, but I found it, an empty baby book. But she did comment.
That's what my daughter's going to find.
Yeah. I didn't even, to be fair, I don't even own a baby book for my children. But she did write Iran Contra affair, escalating, Cold War, imminent, like global meltdown, disaster, and global warming. And I was like, oh, interesting.
Ooh,
I know, prescient. But it's kind of the same, right? Like these patterns, I think we are so convinced that this time is unlike any other. And then when you look back, it's like, oh no, we're just repeating or cycling through the same events and creating new ones, certainly. But
we just have, obviously different access to information.
Yeah. I mean, that seems the main thing, tech. But I'm sure like you, like Game Boys were going to destroy us, TV certainly. Mm-hmm. And I'm okay. I mean, you guys all seem highly functioning.
Fantastic.
So tech. And right now I know Jonathan.
Yeah, that's going to terrify a
I know, it's terrifying
bunch
me.
of
I'm like,
people.
please stop posting. I know.
Right.
Jonathan Haidt's book. I can't remember what
The Anxious Generation.
The Anxious Generation.
That's a great title.
It is.
But it already makes you anxious.
It's a little bit opposite of what you're trying to do.
It is
which
the
is
opposite.
to get us all to calm down and focus on repair. And what I'm sure most of the questions you get are about technology.
Lately, and I think that's just because kind of what's happening, because there's been some alarm bells that have gone off.
And how do you feel about that?
I mean, I address this in the book, and I feel like I haven't changed my view. I don't think it's great for our kids. I would say on balance, do I wish social media didn't have particularly social media, but much of technology didn't have, I wish we had a guarantee that we weren't doing damage.
Right.
I think that's more what we know. We know that it's not damaging. I think a lot of the studies are correlational. And so we can draw a lot of conclusions, but I wouldn't hang my hat on them. I lean on, we have ourselves. We can do the same. I mean, not to go back to the 5 principles, but if you're in a relationship with your kids and you are able to feel close and connected and empathize with them and let them know that they really, really want this, or they might already have it because you decided it was totally appropriate at a certain age, and then you realized, you know what, we're getting some more information. This is really looking more bleak than I thought, or this particular child is responding to it in a way that makes me more concerned. Then you have a close enough relationship to take the risk of changing your rules and saying, like, my decision to keep you safe is different now that I have more information. Here's what we're doing. But your relationship keeps that you have the confidence of knowing you can set a boundary and a limit. And I really believe, and then you'll make repairs when your kid is like, you've ruined my life.
Right.
So the reason I'm not as scared of technology is because I am so confident in our capacity to be a little bit more emboldened to do something about it, while we're waiting for tech companies that definitely need to make some serious adjustments and have more transparency and better limits and better protections. But I don't feel like we're so helpless.
Yeah.
I think we really can be there for our kids. They can experience these difficult challenges because they have us and because we're available to kind of assess and decide on our limits.
Yeah. I mean, as a parent, I feel like I have the 2 boys, 7 and 10, and that my limit setting is highly responsive to sort of how strung out they seem that day. And sometimes it's like, you got to go outside. It's my book is about how conditioned by culture we are and how programmed we are by culture. And so how hard it can feel like in your family of origin to hold the tide. And I certainly too, my 7-year-old in particular, they're not interested in social media, which is a relief, but they sure like my 7-year-old in particular, FaceTiming his friends to play video games communally. I'm sure many people in this room can relate. And it's fascinating, one, because there are other moms in the school who I would think would be like, you are absolutely not allowed to play Fortnite. But I can tell you every 2nd grade boy is on this call, which I think is like, do we then all feel good about this? I guess we all feel good. Like you become sort of equally complicit. But then you listen to them also like problem solve and have confrontation. And I'm like, it's not all bad.
None of this is all bad. And you're paying attention. And if they're problem solving and getting outside and they're doing other things, and this is just one thing, then of course this is not the end of days. I think the problem is for the kids for whom it's really bad. And
where it's like so addicted, or
they're so addicted, or their self-esteem is so plummeted, or they're spending so much time on it. Now I'm going, I'm toggling between gaming and social media, but for all of it, it's like, we do have to pay attention to our kids. If they are struggling, with their mental health, it's probably not going to be a positive. except for the kids who figure out a way with their families to have moderate use and only use it with things that are supporting their mental health and creating community. But it's so, I think society does make it hard, because if, they used to have a thing, wait till 8th, that kind of was a fail because nobody was doing it. And also it was an age cutoff instead of thinking about the individual need of the kid and the family. And that was just too much to ask of people. So now Jonathan hates calling for an even larger ask of everyone. And that I wonder if his approach to say, like, wait till 16 for social media is so that we stop giving it, like, if we think it should be 13 and we start giving it at 11, maybe this will push people to push it, so it may be that his alarm bells are there in a smart way to scare people into just pushing it off a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, it's so tough. And in the internet in general, just thinking about YouTube, for example, and I know my kids have seen things that they didn't.
Yeah, YouTube is tricky.
It's tricky. But then also I was interviewing David Eagleman, who's a neuroscientist. Have you listened to his podcast?
No.
He's great. And he's developed
podcasts. I'm just kidding.
Podcast. But he was saying as a neuroscientist, he's developed all these devices to help around hearing and sight and other sensory deprivation. But he was saying, like, yes, there are concerns about technology, but it's also amazing to think about how you get these neurons firing in the way that at the dinner table when we were young, the conversation would end because nobody knew the answer to the question unless you had like a Encyclopedia Britannica from, but truly. And he's like, now it's like kids and people can follow their curiosity and keep going and learning and learning. And he's like, and that's stunning in terms of its upsides. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think if we were able to train ourselves and our kids to learn how to look for content that's reliable and valid, I think that's true.
Yeah.
But I don't think that there are protections in place that give us any sense of whether the information we're getting is accurate or disinformation or misinformation.
There. And so much of it is, as you guys know, so inane. That's the other thing. You're like, why?
Also, right. It's also information that we definitely don't need. And there is such a thing as pruning with, our brains when we're little. And I feel like we need a big old pruning for ourselves because of all the information that's coming at us, and just having a way to decide, where to put your time is harder and harder. So yes, and about what he's saying.
Do you feel like in your practice that most kids are sort of within the bounds of like the super highway of like being pretty typical and pretty balanced and pretty reasonable with like some offshoots, like that you're with most parents, you're like, it's generally, you're going to be okay. I know every child is complex,
like about
and unique.
Technology or life?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Like that it's like phases, like how, because I think so many of us are, I mean, maybe I'm only speaking for myself. Like I pathologize my kids in the same way that I was pathologized.
Yeah. We need to stop pathologizing everything in ourselves and our kids. And even for things that are pathology at this point, I feel like we're questioning what is neurodivergent versus pathology, what is just a phase versus a personality disorder. Like, I think in general, we are wired for resilience.
Mm-hmm.
So if we just don't get in the way of that, I feel like we can do this and our kids can do this. I'm also not afraid of the little, I don't think we're getting out of this with our kids not saying we screwed them up a little bit.
Well, then they wouldn't need therapy.
They would be
and
so
like therapy
boring.
is so fun.
Yeah. So we have to have a little flavor.
Yeah.
So we just don't want the kinds of things that lead to self-harm, the kinds of things that lead to debilitating depression, the kinds of things that, are really scary. But a little bit of, uncomfortable feelings
is important.
Is kind of important. So I'm not as worried about that.
Yeah. So I know it's in the book and some of you have probably read it or you're going to.
Moms don't have time to read books.
But when you're working with parents, what are the things where you're like this, and this is a big question, I know, but like, these are the things that what are the big flags for you?
I think the first thing above all else, and I'm pretty sure anybody in the field of health, mental health, certainly would say, check your sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Because before you would even address any issue, you'd want to make sure, just like we wouldn't make a decision, you don't want to make a decision on a bad day or a tired day if you can help it. So if you're getting persistent just sleep issues, that is, who knows what's really going on with our emotional life when we're operating from poor sleep. So I think that's the most important thing. I'm sure nutrition matters a little bit, just not as much as again, not if it gets in the way of your relationship and your brain space. Like if you're fixated on how many bites your child took or what everybody's eaten for lunch, it's now not the concern about the healthy food is overshadowing the healthy overall tone.
Yeah. That's good to know. I think, right?
Because I think you can think of it as for all of this, more often than not, my kids are getting the nutrients they need.
Yeah.
And then if that's the answer, we're good. And they need to move every day. And then other than that, those sort of basics, I think it really, I tell everybody, once you've checked those boxes, then you can really assess how your kid is doing.
Yeah.
But before you've checked those boxes, let's take a quick, walk to get ourselves outside, especially in California, but in general, to move outside. You are in Montana. You could get in the cold.
No. And I definitely, throughout, I'm sure I always would diagnose my children as a broken robot, but it's true. Like that moment where you're like, oh, you're wiped or you're getting sick.
You need a little bit of oil.
Yeah.
But I do feel like that makes such a huge difference. And then you can get into your relationship, which is the most powerful thing we have. And having the rules and the boundaries.
What's the thing that you see sort of in the collective parenting world that drives you the most crazy? You can give me 3 things. Okay. But like, what do you see and you're like, oh, stop.
I think fixating on the minutia.
Yeah.
And like micromanaging just like every interaction just does not have to be so meaningful. Like I can't stress that enough. I think pathologizing parenting, there's something like out there in the world that just feels like we are operating from the assumption of such deep trauma and such psychopathology that we're now worried about our own and our like every move that our kids are making. Like is this interaction, are they going to be codependent because of this or whatever it is? So I think that gets me, because it's just that the pendulum swung too far. We do need to be somewhat aware of these things, and there is generational trauma that patterns that you want to break, and all those things are meaningful, but they're not for everybody, and they're not all the time.
Yeah.
And the idea that there's like one passionate right way really kind of drives me crazy. Like we don't actually know that.
Yeah.
So when people have that certainty about something procedural, like how your kid falls asleep, or something that's like, whether you breastfeed or not, there's something that's going to somehow let us know if we're going to have a kid who turns out well or a kid who doesn't. It bothers me.
Yeah.
Whether we give them rewards or we don't give them rewards, like these are very, small details in the big picture of whether our kids will thrive. Do I think that, for example, rewards, I guess, let me say that again. I think that the strong opinion about it bothers me. Like, for some people, having a rewards plan for certain things is super helpful. Getting a reward for everything is not.
Yeah.
But the idea that we're so kind of extreme and we just know that this is the way, so that we can't kind of say, well, sometimes this is probably going to work for me and sometimes this works for me. I think that is my third. Was that 3?
Yeah. No, I think that's helpful. I mean, I certainly bribe my children. I don't bribe them all the time, but
right. But there's a time and a place.
I bribe them to read books.
Because you're making a choice with your values that wiring the habit of reading is more important to you than their internal motivation to read.
Exactly. If they're going to read for V-Bucks or
like,
Robux,
that's fine.
That's going to happen.
Yeah. But I think that that's a perfect example. You've made a decision.
I really just brought you guys all here so I can be affirmed. But it is, I mean, there's nothing more terrifying than parenting, right? There's no A/B test. There's no sort of like, I'll do this and then I'll choose the better outcome, right? You're just on. When, and then are there big sort of buckety, I know we talked about sleep and whatnot, but warning signs that you feel like parents miss?
Yeah, I think one thing is anger is so misunderstood. Anger is so highly linked with anxiety.
Oh.
So especially
say more.
Especially in young people, and most especially in adolescence. So if you're getting a lot of anger, in our natural reaction would rightfully be to say, like, are you kidding me? Like, you cannot speak to me like this. This is unacceptable. Maybe if it's a little one, you wouldn't say that. But you would still potentially ask yourself, like, what did I do? What,
right.
Like, I can't, what's going on here? And you might even meet it with a fight back, especially as your kids get older. And I find it both helpful and important for us to remember that anxiety presents itself. And so does, by the way, depression.
Fear and grief.
Yeah. So depression in an adolescent might look like a really angry person. And you're expecting somebody who's not getting out of bed, somebody who's seeming very down. And that's confusing because it just doesn't look the same. And so paying attention to our kids' affective state with curiosity will be more helpful than sort of getting in the soup with them, with the caveat that I don't want every moment of like a kid snapping to be everybody now going, they're probably depressed.
Right. But it's more sort of, what's the right process? Like letting them experience and express while recognizing that it might be shame. What is anger is often secondary to fear, anxiety, grief, and shame.
Well,
and sometimes it's just anger.
And sometimes it's just, that's why I'm careful, because I just want everybody not to read into everything. And also, like, it's okay if all of those things are happening. It doesn't have to be fixed.
Yeah.
It's just more like, okay, I'm going to pay attention to this instead of scream back.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that also it's an excuse for being disrespectful. It can just allow you a moment to just kind of pull yourself out of the situation and say, like, we definitely need to talk about this. It feels like now's not the time for either of us. I'm here when you're ready to talk. But you don't have to fix the feeling, and you don't have to call a psychiatrist immediately. But if it's happening over and over for, a while, and you're just seeing that kind of change, I would definitely check in with someone.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. How are we doing on time? Should I open it up?
Whenever you guys are whatever. Sure. And I bet everyone has questions.
Yeah. Do you guys have questions?
Yeah.
We're basically just chatting.
I know.
Coffee, vodka, therapy.
Can I,
Yeah.
just from what you just said,
Yeah.
hear when you're ready to talk, what if you have a child that like just, and trying therapy, but like that just refuses to talk about feelings in that case?
So I would say it depends on whether or not the child is doing okay. Like if they're moving through their day, they are getting adequate sleep, they are eating, they are showing up to school, all those things are happening. They just might not be people that talk about their feelings. And if they have positive ways of coping with those feelings, not harmful ways of coping, then I wouldn't even worry about it. I would just find ways to connect that aren't about feelings, because some people just are not feelings talkers. That's just not their jam. But if you're seeing maladaptive coping mechanisms, then you might need to just spend a lot of, get to know a therapist that over time will be there for extra support. It takes a long time for therapists to get in there with those kids that don't want to talk. But that doesn't mean that you don't offer that opportunity.
Any other questions? Yeah.
How was the experience of writing these books for both of you?
Oh, deep therapy. Yeah. I mean, my book's about patriarchy and how the essential thesis is that women are conditioned for goodness and a socially constructed idea, socially mediated idea of goodness, whereas men are conditioned for power. And the book isn't really about men, but it's through the construct of the 7 deadly sins. And I was not raised in a religious household. My father's Jewish, my mom's a recovering Catholic, and they're both like feminist, sort of not very patriarchal. And yet this was so alive in me, like this idea of what it is to be a good woman. A good woman is never tired, has no wants of her own, always happy to subjugate anything that she wants to other people's needs, never needs
Was that mother?
Yeah. Yeah. Never needs praise, attention, affirmation, has no hunger, has no sexual desire, but like is here for it. A willing vessel, and is never mad or upset about any of it. And I recognized like, that's me, that's my script, that's what's alive in me. And then I trace it back to the sins. And originally I was just going to write a book diagnosing culture and presenting all the research. And then my editor was like, no, you have to put yourself in here. Oh my God. And then it was like, but I don't really have that. And then it was like, oh, this is what I have the most of. This is at the center of my life.
Remember, we did a little book club with, basically I enlisted Elise to host a book club of her own book for my daughter and her friends and whatever. And it was really cool. But one of the things that I thought was funny is that one of the moms said, I don't have any of these things have not been ingrained in me. I don't feel any of these inclinations. And her daughter was like,
bullshit.
Yeah, I'm going to call you out on that. So I think that is inevitably what happens is, and that happened to me when I read the book too. I was like, no. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it was intense, very intense experience. You loved your process.
Yeah, I want to do this all the time. No, I think that the marketing part and the title and book cover and like the things that I didn't know were
part of it,
designated job. Little fun fact is that Elise actually came up with my book title because I was really struggling. And she was like, oh my God, just do this.
Oh, it got complicated. There's another book that has her podcast name.
Yeah, so it was confusing. So, but yeah, so for me, that part of the process from, till now, even just something that I think is addressed in here and something that was very hard for me is just even the act of saying, buy this work.
Oh, it's the worst.
It's a terrible feeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I'm like, unless you don't want to, because you're busy, who cares? Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
That's,
I mean,
Zimmy's like, that's from a
It's
publishing
hard.
perspective. This is not the dream comment.
No.
But it's really, it's tricky. And I think it's really hard to raise kids with that book all over your living room. And then every time you do anything, have them say like, which one of the principles is that?
Yeah. She has teenagers. Spicy. Yeah.
This is not a question so much as a thank you for this great conversation. I am a pediatrician for over 40 years, so I'm deep into a second generation. And I have to say it is really different.
Mm.
Oh, let's hear this.
Before COVID. I just want to say what I loved about your book. It was a breath of fresh air compared to, and you all will be able to read cover to cover someday. Compared to all the books that come out saying, this is how you have to do it.
Yeah.
Because I think you used a line in there pretty similar to what I always say to parents. There's so many great ways to do this. And you have to find what works in your house. And if there's anything I could teach parents in this day and age, it would be find your common sense again. Because you know some of this stuff is crazy. And it's crazy for your family or your house or your kids. I practice in the Valley, and I will say, but I live around here. The difference, even just in those two locales, is hugely different in how we parent. But everyone comes in saying, "I can't do that. I had to do that."
Yeah.
It's really hard. They don't trust the grandparents because they don't know the rules anymore.
Yeah.
Where are you getting the rules?
So
You have
good.
to question that.
No,
Thank you. Kardashians instead of from the experts. And I do want to say, I've heard you speak in webinars big into the ACEs stuff that you.
Oh, thank you.
But yeah, I'm a very old-fashioned pediatrician.
What a great,
And
that's
chill.
so lucky.
Yeah, well, there won't be many of us left, but that's a different conversation. The site, that Mount Sinai site, I wish I had that in my parenting.
I'm like,
life.
oh, Zibby's.
Huh? She has
Zibby's also involved.
I would say when you're scrolling at night and you can't read a book, go there. I mean, you should be sleeping. That's of course what she said about sleep is true, but that site is amazing. And yeah.
Well, we definitely
Mount
Mount Sinai Parenting Center.org. God, I think.
Is
that terrible? Yeah, it should be.
And also, and when you read her credits, it tells you where to get it. But you just can name any problem or any. I like to say the hiccups.
Hiccups,
Right?
agreed.
Along
Hiccups
that
feels
road.
more manageable.
Right. So, I think your generation has been sold some kind of crazy stuff. Like I feel we need to do a lot more for the parents. You deserve a lot more than this.
Yeah.
So also I see the parents waiting a year for their annual free checkup with this laundry list of questions. Now all of your pediatricians are doing telemedicine now, and if they're not, find another pediatrician. So you can call when your kid's asleep or your kid's not there, and you can have a conversation and say, my kid is exhibiting this behavior that makes me really nervous. What do you think? And most pediatricians, they're aware of that. We talk about it all the time, and I'm in a bunch of groups with pediatricians, and we're all saying kind of the same stuff. I've never seen so many sadly depressed, anxious teenagers in my life. I have no other practice because I've been doing it for a long time, and it's real. But I feel they learned it on YouTube. They learned how to do eating disorders.
I was going to say that is such a terrifying component because they actually learned how to do eating disorders.
Yes.
And I think that it's something like teenage girls eating disorders are up by 46%.
And boys, we never used to see
And boys.
but now we see it in boys.
Yeah. So and there's so much terrifying stuff. The Center for, I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, but I think it's something like the Center for Countering Digital Hate did a they created these 13-year-old girl profiles. And then they created some that just said like Zibby 13 and some that said Zibby dieting 13 and compared, and they videotaped this. They created these TikTok accounts. I'm going to get it slightly wrong, but you can go to their website. They created these TikTok accounts, and within something like 8 seconds to the ones where it said like Zibby diet, blah, 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 they were fed content that would be so clearly pro eating disorder. And then if it just said the 13-year-old girl, it took 2 minutes. But then after 2 minutes of scrolling, they were getting consistent content and it's sort of like how to build an eating disorder. So even if they weren't high-risk kids, because the thing is I check algorithms. I think it's really important to just pop into your teenager's algorithm and let them know, like, I just am checking in.
How do you do that?
You just look at the TikTok. I think TikTok you just don't do.
Mm-hmm. But you can actually see it.
But you can see the algorithm on it's not telling you what the algorithm is, but if you look at the Explore page,
okay,
you could tell, like you can see my Explore page is a lot of funny animal. I have a private account and a public account. And my public account, the Explore page is like, in no great shock, mostly something related to mental health or parenting or pediatrics. But my private one is many weird like funny, cute animals and certain neck creams and like over and over. And so that's my algorithm, like that, what's on my mind. It's not that deep. But then I look at my daughters because I want to see that, if we're seeing a lot of silly rabbit videos, that's quite different than if I'm seeing, pictures over and over about a war, or I'm seeing, so there's disinformation or just diets. And that's a different kind. That kid's having a different experience than the kid who's got puppies and bunnies.
Wait, how do you change it then?
So, well, I would do two things. First, I would figure out how much you're monitoring. And I don't mean monitoring like surveillance, but just like mentor monitoring. And I would probably make more times in the day when social media is off limits, just to turn down how much of the terrible content you're getting thrown in your face. And also I would just have a conversation and just say, here's what this algorithm is telling me, that I should be a little bit worried. And in order to support your safety, let's take a break. I think you can also, this is very anecdotal and based on zero science, but I will say that after October 7th, my feed, because I was going down rabbit holes, got pretty nerve-wracking to say the least. And there were a couple weeks there where I would say my algorithm was incredibly toxic, and I felt in my whole body what the experience must be for so many teenagers when they're getting inundated with content that's disturbing. And I sort of unfollowed and redirected what I would put my eyeballs on back to just like animals, truly like dogs playing with whatever. And it did revert back, but it took a few weeks. And I was very unhinged by it.
The Social Dilemma is good to watch with teenagers too, because it explains the algorithm. Like I feel like for my daughter, at least, like when I explain, when you follow this, they're going to send you this. Like they don't get that.
Yeah, you do really want to talk about it. I will say the Social Dilemma is so outdated now.
Yeah, well, it's like I haven't watched it since it came out. But I feel like she understood like what they're marketing to you. So if you follow this, you're going to get more of this.
Right.
They know who you click on, and it sends you there.
Yeah, and it's important to have those conversations about. But just remember, young brains are not equipped to even manage that information. And by the way, even younger brains. I was just I was talking to somebody yesterday about just brain development. We have to think about where your brain is in development, so that like, yes, there's individual differences. So you're going to think about each kid and their temperament. There's also like, if your kid believes in the tooth fairy and Santa and monsters, it's because their brains are still In elementary school up until 9 or 10, they are not thinking like scientists in that way. Yes, they are curious, they're scientists, they're asking questions, but they also believe in fantasy. So all of the content they're getting, if it is marketed as real, like an ad or information, they're going to assume that it's true. And then when you get into adolescent years, they're a little bit more dubious, but they're still, you can't see something over and over and have it normalized and not kind of assume that it's true. Mm-hmm. You have to have some kind of magic brain to withstand that.
Yeah.
I have a question. Thank you for what you shared, by the way.
Yeah.
I made common sense, a priority. I underline that. And that made me think of my question to you guys, or maybe to you, but both of y'all. Do you think that parents are getting more self-aware? So it's kind of to your question, Elise, about tracking over time your career. And I thought to myself when I had kids compared to my mom, I just want to be more self-aware than my mom. That was like one of my goals. And she's a therapist. She's a retired therapist. And then I read Elise's book and it was like, oh, I have all this conditioning that
I know. It's a real eye opener.
To me, being self-aware would be such a benefit to our children. Is there hope for that? And do you see that in the conversations that you're having with parents? And maybe both of y'all in your conversations with, sounds like predominantly women. But is there hope in that?
We even lost our man.
That's hilarious. He's like, all right, I get it. It's not productive. I think, well, one thing, there is research that shows that when you kind of come to terms with, reflect and come to terms with your experience being parented, that you do have a much higher likelihood of having a secure attachment relationship with your own child. Having said that, that presumes that, I should tell you, most people have secure attachment relationships. So to go back to everything that I just want to make sure we keep the tone of on balance, we're meant to be okay. But so self-awareness is wonderful. Getting too stuck, too extreme in the, I guess, self-awareness to the point of forcing psychoanalysis on our kids, where we're like, I'm going on my journey to get to know myself. And so in doing so, I'm going to share what I think about you right now, is when I think we're getting a little too over the top. But our own, unfolding as humans and being curious about ourselves and how we come to be who we are, I think that's kind of fun forever.
Yeah. And I would say that I think making conscious what's like been running us in unconscious ways is helpful, if only because you're like, oh, that's what this is.
Exactly. It doesn't have to have a solution.
Yeah, but that it's that's not enough to resolve it. But it's better to be like, oh, I know what's alive in me right now. Like, I recognize that no one's asking me to do this, but this is like my own compulsion. Has been helpful, I think, more in my marriage than with my children, but sort of like,
maybe when they get a little bit older.
Yeah. Yeah. But that once you bring it up, you're like, oh, I see it. I see the matrix. Doesn't mean I'm free, but working on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
I just have a question. How do you recommend the balance of like the common sense parenting with like kind of how I feel like we're kind of trained to like almost let these little people, you want them to feel and express everything, but yet they also still need so much guidance. And like, I never realized that as much until my parents come to town, especially my dad. And we'll be like going to do something and I'll give my like 3-year-old like 8 choices. And my dad's like, you didn't have any choices till you were 16. So like, it feels like such a balance of the two, like how do we, I guess, get back to that common sense, but still recognize the self aware, if that makes sense, because it sounds like we're going kind of one way or the other.
Yeah, I think that the boring middle is very helpful. But in terms of choice, too much choice that's another, I I think another one of those anxiety provoking experiences that we keep having, these repeated, like we're 3 and we're in charge. That's scary. But also it's nice to when it's possible to help support a child's growing autonomy. That's super linked with resilience. So I think the balance is like having moments where you know what's important, and so you're just like, it just is. You've explained why, and it just is. If it's including taking your time, if you're just like, I don't have time for choice right now, and then finding moments in the day when 2 choices are super reasonable and you have time for it. I think whenever you feel like something is excessive, just meeting it somewhere in the middle between a parent, a grandparent saying you didn't have choices until you were 16 and they 8 choices. One little note about grandparents, just because you mentioned it, is that, and I do say this in the book, we can't control other people, and they're definitely going to have different ways. And I do this with my mother a little bit because she's my mom, so it's fine. I'm sure she would disagree. But like, first of all, kids need to learn how to move through the world with people who have different ways of interacting with them. And so I like grandparents who say wackadoodle things. I think it's important. And second, except my mother-in-law for some reason. But the second thing is that there's almost no grandparent who's doing something wrong enough that the benefit of the relationship with the grandparent doesn't far outweigh if they like did it wrong, quote unquote. And then finally, they're probably not doing it wrong. They're doing it different.
Yeah. And isn't so much of life, I feel this way with my parents where I'm like, you did it this way, I'm going to do it this way. Neither of us are right.
Right. We'll find
clearly the middle, but like you denied me everything and I indulge my children too much. So I know this is crazy making for you, but that's why it's fun.
But it's true.
Yeah.
And also when you do the opposite, there's a tiny little message to the parent or in-law that they were failures.
Yeah.
There's just like an underlying message, which hurts.
Very subversive.
So, oops.
Yes.
And that hurts. And so you're going to get like a hurt back reaction. That might be a snide comment. And I totally understand both sides of that. And the funny thing is, it probably is some version of the middle. I do like everybody to kind of have a think about, what is my inclination? What's easy for me? Like, is it easy for me to be super sensitive and talk about feelings? Or is it easy for me to toe the line and kind of say, here's what's really important. These are my limits. These are my boundaries. And whichever thing you're really good at, don't pay any attention to for a little while. Just kind of make a little bit of an effort on the part that's not natural for you. You're not going to turn a super sensitive, mushy parent into an ice cube just because you are only focused on limits. And you're probably not going to turn a person who's really, really assertive about and, controlling about limits and boundaries into, a permissive parent. So just leaning into the challenge of what you don't naturally feel is super easy, I think can help you come to the middle.
Yeah. I know we have to open the store and you sign books.
Sign books.
Yeah.
Buy books. Sign books.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Sign
guys.
Thanks, everyone.
We needed hours.
We might not make sense as a podcast because we're like never on one theme.
Let's do another podcast.
But now I want to do another one.
You guys, thank you so much.